I recently watched this science fiction movie called Project Hail Mary, which showcases a mysterious single celled microorganism in space called Astrophage. In the story, scientists notice a strange infrared trail, a kind of energy signature stretching from the Sun toward Venus, a phenomenon called the Petrova line. And that is what leads them to discover this microorganism, which turns out to be a light eating microbe that absorbs energy from the sun and reproduces using carbon dioxide from Venus. As it spreads, it begins to reduce the amount of solar energy reaching Earth, and if nothing stops it, the result could be catastrophic. It could trigger a global cooling event that threatens humanity's survival within just a few decades. The main character, Ryland Grace, is a middle school teacher with a PhD in molecular biology. He is sent on a desperate one-way mission aboard the spaceship Hail Mary to Tau Ceti, the one nearby star system that seems to resist this microorganism, to understand why and find a way to save Earth. Now, of course, Astrophage itself is fictional. When I first watched this movie, one question immediately came to my mind. How much of this is actually real? Can a microorganism really survive in space like this? Can it adapt and behave in such complex ways? It sounds extreme, but when you start looking at the science, some parts of this idea may not be as far from reality as they seem. Because when we look at life on Earth, life does not exist in only comfortable conditions. In fact, there are organisms that live in places that would be completely hostile for most life. These organisms are called extremophiles. They can survive and, in many cases, grow in conditions like extremely high temperatures, freezing environments, highly acidic or alkaline conditions, and very high pressure deep in the ocean. In some cases, life has been found more than 10 kilometers deep in the ocean, several kilometers deep within the Earth's crust, and even in environments with almost no nutrients. So these organisms are not just surviving, many of them are actually adapted to these conditions. What seems uninhabitable to us is completely normal for them. And this includes different types of organisms, from bacteria and archaea to even more complex life forms known as eukaryotes. Some of them can even tolerate multiple extreme conditions at the same time. But space is still a very different kind of environment. Unlike extreme environments on Earth, space combines multiple stresses at the same time: microgravity, high levels of radiation, and complete isolation. So the question becomes, what actually happens to life in space? Interestingly, scientists have tested this directly. In some experiments, microorganisms were placed on the outside of spacecraft exposed to vacuum, radiation, and extreme temperatures. And in some cases, certain microbes were able to survive, but mostly when they were protected in some ways, especially from one of the most damaging factors in space, solar radiation. But when directly exposed, many of them did not survive. So, this tells us that life can endure extreme conditions, but often under limited or protected conditions. And even this is very different from what we see in the movie, because in real life, a large part of what we know about life in space comes from controlled environments like the International Space Station. When humans go to space, their bodies begin to change. Studies from the International Space Station on astronauts, especially during long-term missions, have shown something very interesting. The microbiome begins to change across different parts of the body. This includes the gastrointestinal tract, the skin, the nose, and even the mouth. And in particular, the intestinal microbiome can shift, including changes in the abundance of certain bacterial groups, and in some cases, a reduction in overall diversity. And importantly, these changes do not always last. Studies have shown that microbial diversity, especially in areas like saliva, can shift during spaceflight and in some cases decrease. But after returning to Earth, many of these changes begin to recover. And this pattern is seen more broadly as well across the oral, skin, and nasal microbiome. In other words, for many parts of the body, these changes appear to be temporary and begin to reverse once normal conditions return. But it doesn't stop there, because in space, it's not just that your microbiome changes, you also start shaping the environment around you. Studies from the International Space Station have shown that the microbes found on the surfaces inside the spacecraft can actually resemble those from the astronaut's own body, especially from the skin. In other words, the environment in space begins to reflect the people living in it. And this goes even further. When scientists studied microorganisms on the International Space Station, they found that the bacteria found there are not completely new or alien. In fact, they are very closely related to bacteria already found here on Earth, including those that already exist in the human body. For example, bacteria like Enterobacter buchandensis have been identified on surfaces inside the International Space Station, including areas like the waste and hygiene compartments and even the exercise platform. And when these bacterial strains were compared to those on Earth, they show a high level of similarity, which suggests that these microbes are not coming from outer space. They are being carried into space through humans, cargo, and life support systems. And over time, these microbial communities do not stay fixed. They begin to shift, adapting to the conditions of the space environment. This includes traits linked to survival, such as resistance to stress and, in some cases, to antibiotics. And interestingly, across different locations inside the International Space Station, many of these microbial communities are quite similar. And based on their genetic features, some of them resemble bacteria that are known to cause disease in humans. But this does not mean that they are harmful in that environment, only that they have the potential. So, in many ways, the International Space Station starts to resemble other environments we know on Earth, like hospitals, offices, fitness centers, or any closed indoor space where humans live and interact. But there is another important layer to this. In space, it's not just the microbes that change, the human body changes too. Studies have shown that during spaceflight, the immune system can become less effective. At the same time, your microbiome also begin to shift. This includes bacteria in your gut, your airways, your saliva, and your nose, which we already discussed. Now, this does not mean that something goes wrong immediately, but it does mean that the balance between your body and your own microbes can change. And when that balance shifts, even normally harmless bacteria can start to behave differently. At the same time, microorganisms in the spacecraft environment can also adapt, including changes in how they grow, their behavior, and in some cases, how they respond to antibiotics. So, what you have is this combination: a weakened immune system, changes in your own microbiome, and microbes in the environment adapting to new conditions. And together, this may increase the risk of infections during long duration space missions. So, even the bacteria that normally protect you may not behave the same way in space. Now, this idea goes even further. Microbes in space are not just affecting humans, they also play an important role in plant growth. And this matters because during long duration missions, astronauts may need to grow their own food. But growing food in space, even inside a spacecraft, is not as simple as it sounds. The space environment itself can be stressful for plants. Microgravity affects how water moves, which can limit nutrient uptake and can cause water to accumulate around roots and leaves. And because of this, potentially harmful microorganisms such as fungi can gain easier access to plant tissues, making plants more vulnerable to infections. At the same time, plant-associated microorganisms can also be affected. Some studies suggest that certain plant pathogens may behave differently in microgravity and in some cases may become more likely to cause disease in plants, which means managing microbial balance in plant systems becomes especially important in space. But not all microbes are harmful. Some actually support plant growth. These are called plant growth promoting bacteria. They can help by improving nutrient absorption like iron and phosphorus, influencing plant growth signals, suppressing harmful microorganisms, and helping plants cope with stress. And just like we saw before, these microbes do not come from space. They are introduced from Earth through astronauts, materials, and routine interactions like handling and watering plants. On the International Space Station, scientists study how these microbes interact with plants and how they can be used to support plant growth in space. This is important for future missions where astronauts may need to grow their own food. And plants such as lettuce have already been grown on the International Space Station. When compared to similar plants grown on Earth, some differences were observed in microbial communities and in certain nutrients. But importantly, no major human pathogens were detected. So, overall, these plants were still considered safe to eat. In other words, even in space, life behaves in ways that are different but still familiar. So, when we go back to the movie Project Hail Mary, the idea of a microorganism surviving in space may sound like pure science fiction, but in reality, life is far more adaptable than we often imagine. Not exactly like astrophage, but not entirely impossible either. And that might be the most interesting part. We are still discovering what life is truly capable of. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe for more evidence-based science content.